It was winter in Alaska, and the kind of cold that made even the strongest things seem fragile. Trees groaned under the weight of ice. Rivers lay silent and hard as iron, and the air itself felt like glass, ready to break. The world was locked in stillness, and every living thing that remained out there had learned to move quiet, slowly, conserving every breath as though each one might be its last. In a small wooden cabin nestled between two ridges, a man lived alone, as he had for many years. His roof was half buried in snow. His chimney sent a faint, crooked trail of smoke into the pale sky, and the tracks leading to his door disappeared after a few meters, swallowed by the wind. His name no longer mattered much. Names for the world beyond the mountain. Here, he was simply a man among silence, a figure molded by cold, wood-smoked solitude. He had come to these mountains long ago, when he was still young enough to be restless and old enough to understand the noise of other men. What drew him here wasn't adventure or escape, but something deeper and quieter. He often said, "The land speaks to those who stop trying to explain it." So he stopped explaining and started listening. The mountains didn't give him peace at first. They tested him. They took comfort from him, warmth, strength, and sometimes even hope. But over time, the man learned that peace is not something given. It's something earned, like the fire that only stays alive if you keep feeding it. Every winter brought its own lesson. Some years it was hunger that taught him humility. Other years it was loneliness that taught him patience. This particular winter, though, brought something else, something ancient, stirred the primal rhythm of survival. For weeks, he had been seeing signs around his traps, paw prints large and deep, circles drawn in the snow around the tree line, faint shadows moving at the edge of dusk. Wolves. He had known they were near even before he saw them. Their presence was in the stillness, in the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. The sound of them at night carried far, low, distant, drifted like smoke across the valley. It wasn't fear that he felt when he heard them. It was respect, even admiration. In the heart of winter, the wolf was a mirror of himself, hungry, alert, and bound to the same laws of endurance. But there was something different this time. These wolves weren't just passing through. They were watching him. He could feel it when he walked to check his lines, when he chopped wood behind the cabin, even when he stepped outside to breathe the frozen air before dawn. Their eyes were always somewhere beyond sight, measuring him, learning his habit. He'd see faint movement between the trees, a shadow that slipped away as soon as he turned his head. Some men would have called it paranoia, but he knew better. He had lived too long in silence not to trust his senses. At first he tried to ignore it. Wolves came and went, that was there. But soon they began to circle closer, following his trail. The man realized they weren't just hunting. They were curious. They wanted to understand him as much as he understood them. So one morning, as he stood by his window, watching the pale light creep over the snow, he decided to speak back, not with words. Words meant nothing out here, but with signs, with movement, with the same language the wolves used to speak to each other. He would answer them with footprints. He packed his snowshoes, rifle, and a small pouch of bait, rabbit blood, feathers, a bit of scent from the hides he cured near the cabin. He stepped outside and felt the sting of the air bite into his skin. The cold was so sharp it made his eyes water, but he didn't blink. The forest waited, vast and silent, and he felt a strange kind of reverence, the way a man might feel standing in a cathedral built of snow and wind. Then he began to walk. His first steps were deliberate, careful. Each print was placed with precision, like strokes of canvas. He walked a long, looping trail through the valley, tracing the edges of the frozen river where he knew the wolves liked to. Every few hundred meters he paused and looked back, studying the pattern he was leaving behind. To anyone else it might have looked like nothing, but to him it was a message. Wolves read the ground the way men read books. Every step said something. Where you were going, how fast you moved, strong he wanted them to think he was vulnerable, to lure them closer, not out of arrogance, but to study them, to learn what they were capable. He made wide arcs through the trees, then doubled back over his own path, stepping exactly into his earlier prints. He crossed streams and climbed ridges, always returning to where he had started, erasing his direction. It was a game of intellect. If the wolves, they would find themselves trapped in fusion, unsure whether they were the hunter or the hunted. He moved like that for hours, his breath heavy, his body soaked in sweat beneath his fur coat. Despite the freezing air, the silence was immense. The only sounds were the soft creak of snow underfoot and the faint hiss of wind over ice. By midday, the sky had turned pale gray, kind of color that warned of more snow to come. He stopped near a stand of black spruce and built a small shielding it from the wind with his body. He warmed his hands, watching the flame flicker and dance in the cold air. As he sat there, he thought about the wolves, how they lived without greed or waste, how every hunt was both necessity and ritual. They didn't take more than they needed, and when they killed, they honored what they took. Men, he thought, had forgotten that kind of balance long ago. When the light began to fade, he turned back toward home, following his own trail in reverse. His tracks, layered and overlapping, looked almost unnatural now, a maze of intention hidden beneath the snow. He knew the wolves would come, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. They would study the ground the way he had studied it, and when they did, he would be waiting. That night, he sat by the fire in his cabin, the room warm and dim, filled with the smell of smoke and pine resin. The wind howled outside, pushing snow against the window like a restless hand. A piece of dried salmon, a bit of hard bread, and listened. Somewhere out there, beneath the rising moon, a wolf called. The sound echoed across the valley, deep and haunting. Another answered, farther away. Then another. The chorus grew, filling the night with the language of hunger and distance. Closed his eye, letting the sound wash through him. It was beautiful, wild, utterly free. When he opened again, stared, the flames twisted and cracked, and in them he saw the reflection of the wolves, shadows moving across endless white, eyes glinting like amber. He realized then that he wasn't trying to outsmart them. What he wanted was connection, a moment of shared understanding between two creatures who had chosen solitude over comfort. The difference was only they had fur and instinct. He had thought and reason, but beneath it all they were bound by the same. The next morning he woke before dawn. The world outside was covered in new snow, smooth and untouched. He stepped out quietly, the cold hitting him like a slap. The sky was faintly blue, the kind of color that only existed for a few minutes before sunrise. He followed the path he had made the day before, each step a careful echo of the last. When he reached the ridge above the river, he stopped. There, beneath the branches of frozen spruce, he saw been waiting for tracks, fresh ones, large, crisp, perfectly defined. Wolves had followed his trail. He knelt and examined them closely. There were at least 5 sets of prints, all leading in the same direction. The leader's paws were deeper, the stride longer. The others followed with perfect spacing, disciplined and silent. He could almost see them moving, the alpha leading, the others ghosting behind, their breath misting in the cold. He smiled slightly. They were playing his game. The man moved forward slowly, reading every mark, every pause. He could see where one wolf had stopped to sniff the ground, another had circled back to check the air. They were cautious, but intrigued. They were learning him. He continued to walk deeper into the forest, his mind working like a map maker, connecting every clue. He would let them get close, close enough to feel his presence without seeing him. That was the key, to let them believe they had the advantage. By midday, he reached a narrow pass between 2 hills. The snow there was deep, the wind funneling through like a river of ice. He found a place where the drifts piled naturally and began to work. Carefully, he set his traps, not hastily, not crudely, but with respect. Each one was cleaned, masked and hidden beneath the powder, indistinguishable from the rest of the ground. When he was done, he backed away, placing his feet into his earlier prints, erasing all sign of his labor. Then he stood there for a long moment, looking out at the silent valley below. It felt almost sacred, this act of creation, deception. He turned toward home as the light began to fade, the sky deepening to violet. The wind carried the faint scent of the fall, the resin, the smoke, the wild musk of unseen. He felt small within it all, but not insignificant. The land didn't care for pride or fear. It only demanded awareness, humility, and endurance. When he reached his cabin again, darkness had already settled. He stoked the fire, fed his dogs, and sat at the small table by the outside. The world was frozen and still. Inside, the warmth hummed softly against the cold. He didn't know if the wolves would take his bait or if they would outthink him. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they had accepted his invitation. The hunt had begun, not of blood, but of understanding. He leaned back, his face lit by the fire, and smiled faintly. In this place, he thought, every footprint is a conversation, every silent story. And perhaps the wolves were the only ones still willing to listen. Now tell me, where are you watching this story from, in this moment of quiet between the man and the mountain, before he ever built that cabin in the mountains, before the snow became his home and the silence his closest companion? He had lived among people, though he rarely spoke of. There was a period when his hands were not shaped by frost, when he still wore clothes, smelled of the city, and believed in things like routine, comfort, and plan the future. He had a small house then, near the coast, where the ocean's voice replaced the wind's. He had a wife, too, and once they had a child on the way. But the sea took both of them one winter, a storm so fierce it erased everything without mercy. The coast had always been his friend, yet that day it turned into something unrecognizable. When the morning came and the tide receded, there was nothing left but a boat shattered on the rocks and footprints leading nowhere. For a long time after that, the man lived among ghosts. He walked through days as if each were made of smoke, speaking little, moving without direction. He tried to stay near people, thinking their noise might drown out the silence that filled him, but it didn't work. Grief made every voice sound distant, every word hollow. The world he had known, the world of faces, roads, clocks, felt unreal. The only place that made sense was the edge of it, the places where human presence ended and the wild began. So one morning, without a note or farewell, he packed what little he owned and headed north. He didn't know exactly where he was going. Maybe that was the point. He followed the direction of emptiness, walking away from everything that reminded him of warmth and human comfort. The farther he went, the quieter he felt inside. The land grew colder, the forests thicker, and the sky there was wider. No one to speak to, and he didn't need words anymore. His body began to adapt. His senses sharpened, his heart slowed. What began as an escape turned into belonging. He found the mountain by accident. At first, he thought it was just another ridge among thousands, but there was something, a stillness, a gravity that called to him. The slopes were steep and wild, the rivers cut deep, and the nights burned with stars so bright they made the darkness feel alive. It was there he decided to stop. He built a shelter first, just enough to keep the wind from killing him. Then, as seasons passed, he turned it into a cabin. Every plank of wood, every nail, every cut of the axe was a conversation with the land. He learned where the water flowed in spring, where the snow piled deepest, where the moose passed each year when the leaves began to turn. In time, he stopped missing the sound of other. The silence was not empty. It was full of detail, of meaning. The drip of melting ice, the crack of trees splitting under frost, the whisper of snow as it fell. He began to realize that what most called solitude was not the absence of company, the presence of everything else. The mountains were alive. They spoke in their own language, one that only revealed itself when you stopped trying to fill the air with noise. He became a trapper not because of necessity, but because it was the purest form of dialogue with that world. To trap meant to understand movement, instinct, hunger, and fear. It required humility, patience, and respect. A good trapper was never at war with nature. He was part of it. He took what he needed, gave back what he could, and never waited. The animals became his teachers, especially the predator. The wolf, above all, fascinated him. There was an intelligence there that mirrored his own, something calculating yet deeply instinctual. Wolves lived by simple laws: survive, protect the pack, follow the rhythm of the hunt, and he saw in those laws a reflection of everything men had forgotten. He remembered his first encounter with one. It was early spring, the ice breaking along the riverbanks, the air smelling of thaw and new growth. He was checking a line of traps when he saw movement among the trees, a gray shape, almost invisible against the shadow. It was watching him, standing perfectly still. For a long moment, they stared at each other, man and wolf, neither moving. There was no threat in that gaze, no fear, only Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and disappeared into the... The man stood there for a long time after, his breath fogging in the cool air, realizing that for the first time in years he had felt truly seen. From that day on, he carried the memory of that wolf like a symbol. It reminded him that isolation wasn't exile, it was transformation. The mountain didn't erase who he had been. It refined him, stripped away everything that wasn't essential. He stopped keeping track of time. Seasons replaced calendars. Hunger replaced schedule. He grew old without noticing, because aging out there was not decay, it was adaptation. His hands grew rough, his eyes sharper, his heart slower but steadier. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the moon was bright enough to paint the snow silver, he would sit outside his cabin with a small fire burning low. He would listen to the forest breathe. The wolves would call in the distance, and he would answer, not with sound, but by being there, by existing as one more living thing among them. The loneliness that had once felt like a wound, like peace. He realized that men seek noise because they fear their own silence. But silence, once you accept it, is not empty. It's clarity. Years passed like that, the kind that leave no mark on a calendar, but carve themselves into your bones. He saw winters that froze even the rivers solid, and summers so short they felt like dreams. He learned to read storms by the color of the sky, to predict thaw. Each hardship made him softer, not hard. The mountain didn't demand strength. It demanded surrender, and in surrender he found strength. Yet, even as he grew at peace with the land, there remained something in him that longed for understanding, a need not to be seen by men, to be acknowledged, the wilderness itself. That was why the wolves mattered. They were not enemies or competitors. They were a question the land asked him. Could he truly live as one of them, guided only by instinct and truth? That was the question behind his plan to lure them with his own footprints. It was not a test of dominance. It was a dialogue, a way to measure how deeply he had learned the rhythm of the wild. The wolves represented something pure, something uncorrupted by human confusion. They killed, but not out of cruelty. They lived, but never beyond necessity. They were free. To gain their acknowledgement, to make them follow his trail, was like earning a kind of silent respect from the land itself. There were nights when he dreamed of his past life. Faces were fading. His wife's laughter came to him like a voice from under deep water, muffled and far. The child he never met was a shadow that moved through his dream, always running just ahead of him, never turning back. But even in those dreams, he did not feel sorrow. He had stopped trying to return to something that no longer existed. The mountain had become his memory, his atonement, and his home. He often wondered what people would think if they saw him now, a man who lived by firelight and snow, who measured days by the length of shadows and nights by the weight of coal? Would they call him mad? A hermit? Maybe. But they didn't understand that madness out here was only another word for freedom. He had traded comfort for clarity, noise for meaning, and the company of men for the company of truth. Sometimes, in rare moments when a bush pilot passed far overhead or a distant echo of a snowmobile reached his valley, he would pause and listen. It wasn't nostalgia that stirred in him, but gratitude that he no longer belonged to that world. He would smile, shake his head, and return to his work, skinning pelts or carving handles for his tools. Out here, he needed nothing more than what he already had: the mountain, the river, the wolves, and the silence that bound them all together. And that was how he came to understand that isolation is not about distant people, but about proximity. The farther he went from the noise of humanity, the closer he came to something sacred, something raw and unbroken. The mountain was not just place, it was a mirror, and it showed him everything he had been running from. In that reflection, he found peace. As he thought about the pack circling his trap, about their intelligence and caution, he felt a strange kinship. They were hunters, yes, but they were also family. They had hierarchy, discipline, patience. They survived not by strength, but by unity. That was something men had forgotten. The quiet power of moving together, of trusting instinct without needing to explain it. When the night deepened again and the fire burned low, the man lay back on his cot and listened to the wind outside. It whispered through the cracks of the cabin, carrying with it the faint echoes of distant howls. He smiled faintly, half asleep. The wolves were near again, and somehow that filled him with comfort instead of fear. He closed his eyes, feeling the slow rhythm of his heart sync with the land's heartbeat, and he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as he drifted into sleep, the wolves howled once more, a sound that was no longer a warning, a song of acknowledgment. Out there in the cold, something wild and eternal had recognized him as one of its own. Now, if you're listening to this story, let it linger for a moment. Think about what the man left behind, what he found instead, and what it truly means to be alone yet never lonely. And if you feel that same pull toward silence, subscribe to this journey, because the next part of his story, the part where the wolves finally come to him, is just beginning. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so quiet that even time itself seemed to move different. Morning came without ceremony, pale light filtering through the frost-covered window, the faint crackle of embers waking before. The man would rise slowly, stretching the stiffness from his body, and listen before he moved. The first rule of living in such silence was to never break it carelessly. Out here, every sound had meaning. The creak of the rafters, the moan of the wind against the cabin walls, the distant snap of ice on the river, all of it was conversation. The land spoke in whispered tremors, and he had learned to listen with the kind of attention that city life made impossible. He would step outside and stand still on the porch for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the light. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, the cold so pure it felt like it burned clean through his chest. The world was colorless at first, just shades of white, blue, and gray. But as the sun climbed behind the ridges, the snow began to glow with hints of gold. Steam rose from the river, where the current ran fast enough not to freeze, and in the far distance the mountain stood, God, unmoving and eternal. He often thought that silence was not an absence of sound, but an expansion of it. When everything unnecessary fell away, what remained became sacred. His routine was not written down or measured by any clock. The body became the only instrument of time. When hunger came, he ate. When fatigue came, when the snow softened underfoot, he knew spring was near. When the wind shifted and carried the scent of earth instead of ice, he knew the thaw was coming. He no longer thought in days or weeks, only in cycle, the kind that had no beginning or end. After checking his traps, resetting lines that had been buried under fresh snow, he would walk the long perimeter of his valley. The route had become a meditation, a quiet communion between him and the land. Every tree, every rock, every frozen bend in the stream had its place, and he could walk it blindfolded and never lose his way. The land had mapped itself into him. He would kneel to examine the faintest track, a hare, a lynx, a fox, and sometimes, in the far edges, the forest thinned, the unmistakable impression of wolves. He followed them not out of curiosity, but out of a strange sense of kinship. They were his neighbors, though neither had walls. He often imagined what they thought of him, this lone figure of smoke and wood smoke, moving through their territory with tools and traps, fire. Did they think him foolish for living without a past, or did they sense, in some distant animal way, that he had once belonged to? Sometimes he would pause, close his eyes, imagine himself among them, running through snow under the moon, guided by hunger and instinct alone, no future, just the now. He never romanticized it. He knew their life was hard and cold, but there was purity in that struggle, a kind of honesty that no human world could imitate. Back at the cabin, the day would stretch long and slow. He would sit by the fire, mending tools, cleaning furs, or carving wood. His hands moved automatically, guided by years of repetition. While he worked, his mind drifted to the simple truths a mountain had taught him. Survival, he thought, was not about fighting nature. It was about learning to stop fighting yourself. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, none of these things were enemies. They were mirrors. They showed him who he really was when all distractions stripped away. Sometimes he would go days without speaking a single word. The voice, when unused, fade to memory. He would think in silence, speak inward, and let thought replace. When he did talk, it was usually to the fire or the wind, a habit that might have seemed like madness to someone else but felt perfectly natural to him. Once he caught himself laughing softly at a raven perched near the window, as though the bird were an old friend stopping by to check on him. And maybe it was. Out here, companion was not bound species. It was bound by present. There were nights the sky was so clear it looked alive. The stars pulsed like living things, and the northern lights moved above the ridges in slow waves of green and violet, bending across the dark as if the heavens themselves were breathing. On those nights, he would stand outside until his skin burned from cold, unable to look away. The beauty was almost painful because it reminded him how small he was. Yet it was smallness that made life precious. To be insignificant among such was not humbling. It was freeing. He had long since stopped fearing death, not because he wanted it, because he understood it. Out here, death was not a failure or tragedy. It was part of the rhythm. He had seen it in every trap he checked, in the cycle of predator and prey, in the thaw that fed the soil. The wolves taught him that most clearly. They did not mourn as humans did. They accepted loss as part of the pattern, then moved on. There was wisdom in that simplicity, a peace born of necessity. He sometimes wondered how people could live surrounded by noise, by endless motion, and still feel so lonely. Here, surrounded by emptiness, he had never felt less alone. Every gust of wind, every snowflake, every distant howl was a reminder that he was part of something far greater than himself. The mountain didn't care about his past, his regrets, or his old grief. It accepted him exactly as he was, stripped down to his most honest form. Still, there were moments when memory returned, uninvited. Smell of smoke, might remind him of her hair, or the way the moonlight fell on the snow might recall the reflection of lantern-light face. But these were no longer painful memory traces, old footprints in melting snow, still visible but fading. He had learned to let them go, not by forgiving. Sometimes, during the deepest part of winter when daylight lasted only a few hours, he would sit by the window and watch the storm. The wind would bend the trees until they groaned, and the snow would rise in wild spirals that erased the horizon. The cabin would, the fire would hiss, and the mountain would roar living beasts. Those nights, he would feel the roar of existence pressing in on him, reminding him truly against the will of. But he never feared it. He would whisper quietly, as if to the storm itself, "Do what you must." And when the wind finally calmed, and the silence returned heavier than before, he always felt reborn. His body carried the marks of this life, scars from tools, burns from fire, the stiffness of cold that never truly left his bones. But his mind was sharper. Isolation had not dulled him. It had clarified. He saw patterns where others struggled. The land had become a teacher so patient, so unrelenting, that it taught not through kindness, but through consequence. Every mistake had a cost. Every act of carelessness was answered, and because of that, every success felt sacred. He often thought about the line between man and beast. Where did it truly lie? Civilization taught that intelligence and language made men superior, but the longer he lived out here, the less he believed that. The animals did not lie. They did not pretend. They lived and died according to the truth of their nature. Humans, he thought, were the only creatures burdened by the illusion that they were separate from the world that made them. One afternoon, after a long hunt through the valley, he returned to find fresh tracks near his cabin, wolf prints clear and close. He crouched, running his fingers through them, feeling the faint warmth still trapped beneath the top layer of snow. They had come near, perhaps even circled the cabin. He smiled, not with fear, but with quiet satisfaction. They had accepted his presence. They knew he was part of their landscape now, neither threat nor prey, just another creature moving through their world. That night, he left a small piece of meat near the edge of the clearing, not as bait, but as an offering, a gesture of respect. The next morning, it was gone. No tracks remained. He took that as an answer. The silence of those days wasn't empty. It was filled with the breath of the mountain, the rhythm of unseen life. He had become fluent in it, understanding pauses and shifts the way others understood words. There was an intimacy in that comprehension, a closeness that made the heart both calm and alert. He no longer wondered what the purpose of life was. Out here, the question itself dissolved. The purpose was the living, the being, the listening. On rare evenings, he would light his pipe and sit outside as dusk fell. The horizon would glow faintly. The forest would begin to hum with the soft sounds of life preparing for night. He would think about the years that had passed, how the man he once was had died somewhere on the road, and he would feel no grief for him, only gratitude. That man had needed the noise, the approval, the belonging. This one needed only the mountain. Sometimes, as he watched the last light fade, he would feel something deep and wordless move inside, a kind of awe or love, or maybe both. It was not directed at anything or anyone. It was simply a feeling of being alive, of existing fully in the vastness of creation. He knew he would never leave this place. Even if one day his body failed and the cold took him, he would remain here in some form. The mountain would keep him, the snow would cover him, and the wolves would carry his scent across the valley. There was peace in that certainty. In the long silence between heartbeats, the man had found everything he had been searching for all along. Not comfort, not redemption, but truth. And in that truth, he finally belonged. The snow came heavy that week, thick flakes falling without pause, layering the land until the valley looked like a world erased and redrawn in white. For days, the man barely saw more than a few meters beyond his cabin window. The air was filled with a soft, endless hum of falling snow. Even the river disappeared beneath a crust of new ice. It was a kind of silence that everything so complete the sound of his own breath loud enough to disturb it. The man didn't fight it. He stayed inside, tending to his fire, sharpening his knife, checking the traps he had brought close to the cabin before the storm hit. He knew better than to wander in weather like this. The mountain demanded patience, and he had learned that rushing through its moods was a form of disrespect. But when the snow finally stopped and the sky cleared, the cold deepened. The world outside froze in absolute stillness. It was the kind of cold that made trees explode in the night from the pressure inside their trunks, the kind that turned breath into frost before it left the lips. The man stepped outside the morning after the storm, snowshoes strapped tight, his fur coat stiff with ice. The valley glared under the new sun, blinding white stretching in every direction. He stood there a moment, breathing it in, silent clarity, the smell of frozen air. Then he saw them, prints fresh and sharp, cutting across the clearing near the tree line. Wolves. There were many tracks, more than he had ever seen so close. They had come during the storm, when even his dogs had stayed silent in their shelter. The prints were wide and deep, circling the cabin, slow, deliberate arc before vanishing toward the ridge. He crouched beside them, running his gloved fingers over the edges. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old. His plan, the game of footprints he had started, had worked. The wolves had followed him, studied him, and now they were here. He felt no fear, only anticipation. This was what he had been waiting for all winter, the unspoken conversation reaching. He packed lightly, taking only what he needed: his rifle, knife, a small satchel of bait, and a coil of rope. He tightened the laces of his boots, checked the wind, and began to follow the trail. The tracks led north, winding through a grove of spruce that had bent under the weight of the storm. The air was sharp, biting against his face, but he welcomed the sting. It kept him alert, alive. The wolves were moving cautious, almost testing him. He could read it in the way their prints shifted direction, doubling back, circling small clearings. They were watching him even now, hidden somewhere among the He didn't look for them. He knew better. To search for what didn't want to be seen was to reveal yourself as uncertain. Instead, he moved as he always did, steady, deliberate, with a calm confidence of something that belongs. Hours passed. The sun climbed, and then began its slow. He followed the trail up the ridge, where the trees thinned and the wind blew hard enough to bite through his coat. There, between two rocky outlines, he saw movement, flicker of gray against the snow. He stopped, crouched low. The alpha appeared first, tall and lean, its fur thick and pale with frost. Behind it, 4 others emerged, silent as shadows. They moved with perfect coordination, a rhythm honed by hunger and time. The man watched as they stopped, heads lifted, sniffing the air. One of them turned its gaze toward him, though he was well hidden behind the ridge. For a moment, man and wolf locked eyes across the frozen distance. There was no malice there, no challenge, only awareness. He could have raised his rifle then. The wolves were close enough, but he didn't. Killing them was never his goal. What he wanted was understanding, a moment of truth that only the wild. He stood slowly, stepping into the open, letting them see him fully. The wolves froze, their breath visible in the cold air, their bodies tense but not yet hostile. The man didn't move closer. He just stood there, his hands at his sides, the rifle slung over his shoulder. For a long while, no one moved. The only sound was the wind sweeping over the ridge, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and snow. Then the alpha took a step forward. It was cautious, proud, deliberate. The others followed, spreading out slightly, not in aggression but readiness. The man felt something ancient stir inside him, an instinct as old as the earth itself. He could sense their hunger, their discipline, their patience. They were testing him, not his strength, but his composure. Wolves respect what does not flinch. He held his ground. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was hard to tell in that timeless space. Eventually, the alpha turned its head slightly, sniffed the wind again, and then, as silently as they had appeared, the wolves moved on. They melted back into the forest, their gray bodies fading into the trees until the land was still again. The man lowered his head, exhaling slowly, a smile forming beneath his beard. It wasn't victory he felt, nor relief, but a strange sense of completion. They had accepted him not as a hunter, but as one of their kind, a solitary being shaped by the same laws of endurance and silence. He followed them a little farther, not to chase, but to learn. The trail led to a clearing where the snow was trampled and stained faintly red. A kill site, a caribou calf half eaten, the rest buried under snow to preserve it. He studied the scene carefully. The wolves had eaten cleanly, efficiently, nothing wasted, nothing left to rot. Even in death, the land was honored. He felt a deep respect then, not for the act of hunting, for the order within it. Nature was not cruel, only precise. As he stood there, a low growl rolled from the trees behind him. He turned slowly. Another, smaller, younger, had lingered behind the pack. Its fur was darker, its eyes bright with curiosity and hunger. It was close enough that he could see the frost clinging to its whiskers. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two solitary creatures bound by the same instinct to survive. Then the young wolf took a cautious step forward. The man stayed still. He reached slowly into his and drew out a piece of dried meat. He tossed it gently onto the snow between them. The wolf hesitated, then stepped closer, sniffed the air, and took the offering. It didn't retreat. Instead, it stood there, watching him with an intelligence that felt almost human. The man smiled faintly and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then, as if satisfied, the young wolf turned and disappeared into the trees, following the others. He remained there long after they were gone, standing in the fading light, the snow falling gently around him. Something inside him shifted then, a small, wordless realization that all the years of solitude had led to this moment, this quiet communion between man and wild. It was not about conquering nature or surviving it, but becoming part of its balance. When he finally returned to his cabin, the fire burned low, and the valley was still. He sat by the window, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, the wolves were resting, their bellies full, their bodies curled against the cold. He felt their presence like a heartbeat beneath the earth, steady and strong. For the first time in many winters, he spoke aloud, his voice rough but steady. We understand each other now. The days that followed felt lighter somehow. He still tended his traps, still split wood and mended tools, but there was a quiet joy in everything he did. The wolves remained nearby, sometimes leaving tracks near the river, sometimes calling in the night. They no longer felt like strangers. Their song had become part of his world, part of the rhythm he lived by. And then, one morning, he discovered something that made him pause. Near the path where he often walked to fetch water, he found a single paw print pressed deep into the snow, larger than the other, clear and deliberate. It was the alpha. But beside it, smaller and lighter, were the tracks of the young wolf. The man studied them for a long time, tracing the shape of the prints with his gloved hand. It felt like a message, a sign of trust. The pack was growing, and they had left their mark not in defiance, but acknowledgement. He stood there for a long while, feeling the weight of that silent converse. In a world that no longer needed words, that print was enough. It told him everything he needed to know, that he was part of something larger, that his solitude was no longer separation, but belonging. The mountain had accepted him, and through it, so had the wolves. As the sun climbed over the ridge, the light struck the snow, making it glitter like shards of glass. He turned back toward his cabin, his footprints marking a path through the fresh powder. Behind him, the wolf tracks lay beside his own, crossing paths, weaving together, disappearing into the endless white. That night, as he sat by the fire, he reflected on what he had learned. The challenge he thought he had set for the wolves had, in truth, been set for him. The discovery was not that he could lure them, but that he no longer needed. The line between hunter and hunted had dissolved, leaving only two kinds of life moving through the same silence. He looked into the fire until it blurred into glowing shapes, and he felt that old, familiar calm settle over him again. He had spent years searching for purpose, but now he understood that purpose wasn't found. It was lived moment by moment, breath by breath, step by step across snow. Outside, the wolves began to sing again, their howls echoing off the ridges, rising and falling like waves of wind. The sound filled the valley, climbed the mountains, and rolled into the stars. The man closed his eyes and listened. In their voices, he heard no distance, no separation, only truth. And as that wild harmony faded into the night, he whispered softly to the darkness, as if the land itself were listening, "We are one." He didn't know if the wolves would return again, or if that had been their final visit. But it didn't matter. The discovery had already been a kind of understanding that doesn't need to be proven again. The man and the pack had read each other's stories in the snow, and in doing so, had learned the language of the mountain. The fire crackled softly, the wind pressed gently against the window, and for the first time in many years, the man felt not just alive, but eternal. And if you followed his footsteps this far, if you felt that same quiet stirring somewhere inside you, subscribe to this story's journey, because what comes next is not about survival anymore. It's about understanding what the world can teach a man once he finally learns. After the meeting with the wolves, the man began to, not outwardly, his days still followed the same quiet rhythm, but something in the way he moved, the silence around him was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. He felt connected to every sound, every movement of wind and branch, as though the mountain itself had begun to breathe through him. There was no longer a sense of separation between his body and the landscape. He had become a living part of it, shaped by its cold, fed by its rivers, steadied by its stillness. The man often thought about how strange it was that he had come to the wilderness to escape humanity, only to find in the wild the truest version of being human. Each morning, he rose before the light touched. The stars still burned cold and clear above the ridges, and the air in his cabin hung motionless. He would sit for a few minutes in the dark, hands wrapped around a cup of strong coffee, listening. The wolves had moved on for the season, following prey north, but he could still sense them out there, distant yet near. Their absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like proof that their visit had meant something. They had come, tested him, understood him, and left him standing where he belonged. That was the way of the pure kind of connection that needed no permanence to be real. He had plenty of time to think, and the thoughts that filled him now were not about hunger or weather or trap. They were about the strange, invisible lines that divided one kind of life from another. He often wondered what the world beyond the mountains had become. The rare times he had ventured down toward the coast for supplies, he had seen enough to remind him why he had left. People rushing with no direction, talking without listening, surrounded by abundance and yet starving for meaning. They built walls to keep out discomfort, and in doing so, they locked themselves away from everything that could teach them something true. He used to think loneliness was the greatest pain a man could feel. Now he knew it wasn't loneliness destroyed people. It was distraction, the endless noise that left no room. The mountain had stripped that away from him slowly, patiently, until there was nothing left himself, the world. And in that stillness, he had found peace, not the fragile kind that depends on comfort, but the enduring kind that grows from understanding. He began to see the same cycles in himself that he saw in the land. When the snow came heavy, he rested more, conserving energy. When spring thawed the rivers, He moved more, setting traps, repairing lines. He realized even his thoughts followed a rhythm, like the changing. There were days when his mind was quiet, like fresh snow untouched by wind, and days when it churned like a storm. But he never resisted it anymore. Everything had its place, its moment. The wolves had taught him that lesson best. Watching them had shown him that life didn't require constant motion to have purpose. Sometimes survival meant stillness, patience, silence. He had seen how they waited for days before a hunt, conserving strength until the perfect moment, and he had learned that this, too, was wisdom. In the world of men, stillness was mistaken for idleness. Out here, it was power. There were moments when he tried to remember the way he used to think back then, before he came here. He could barely recognize that man anymore. The one who had chased after meaning, the noise of cities, who had tried to fill emptiness with things, with plans, the presence. That man had been afraid of silence, afraid to sit alone with his own thoughts. Silence, his oldest companion, and he couldn't imagine life without it. The no longer pressed down on it, carried him. He started to see beauty in things he had once ignored, the way frost formed patterns on the window, like frozen rivers flowing across glass, the deep blue shadow of the mountain at dusk, the way the smoke from his fire twisted upward into the cold air and vanished. Every small detail mattered. He had learned to live in the kind of awareness that most people only felt in fleeting moments of awe. To him, that feeling had become daily life. Sometimes he would sit outside with his back against the cabin wall, watching the valley. The world stretched wide and endless before him, and yet he never felt small in it. The mountain had taught him that significance isn't measured by size or importance, by harmony. To live in balance with something greater than himself was the only kind of greatness that mattered. He began to reflect more deeply on what separated the wild from civilization. It wasn't knowledge or technology, it was gratitude. Out here, every mouthful of food, every spark of warmth, every drop of water was a gift earned by awareness. In the world of men, abundance had turned gratitude into habit. They had so much that they no longer saw it. The trapper often thought that if the earth ever grew tired of feeding them, they would not survive a single season on their own. They had forgotten how to listen, how to observe, how to give back. But in the wilderness, nothing was wasted, nothing taken without purpose. The wolf killed because it had to. The snow fell because it must. The mountain did not question its existence. It simply was. He envied that simplicity, the purity of being without doubt. Yet he also knew that his ability to question, to think, to wonder, was what made him human. And so he tried to balance the two, the animal that survived and the soul that meaning. At night, he would sometimes speak to the fire as if it were an old friend, whispering thoughts aloud not because he needed answers, but because words carried weight when spoken into the silence. He would say things like, "The world forgot its roots," or "Maybe the wolves are the last honest thing left." Sometimes he would just say, "Thank you." He didn't know to whom or for what exactly, but gratitude had become a natural part of him. There were evenings when the northern lights came again, flowing like rivers of color across the sky. He would stand in the open, his breath freezing in the air, his face lit by that soft green glow. Those lights felt like a message, though he could never say from whom. They reminded him of something ancient, that beauty doesn't need meaning to exist. It simply is, like the howl of a wolf, like the whisper of snow, like the beating of his own heart. He sometimes wondered if the world beyond his mountain would ever understand what he had found here. Maybe not. People often needed noise to feel alive. They feared quiet because quiet stripped away illusion. The mountain had no sympathy. It dealt only in truth, and truth is cold water. It shocks you at first, but then it wakes you up. As years passed, the man began to see that he had not chosen the mountain. It had chosen him. Every hardship, every loss, every moment of despair had led him here, like stones laid on a path he hadn't known he was. The isolation he once thought was punishment had become his redemption. In the silence, he had found not absent, but present, the pure awareness of life itself. He realized then that perhaps the greatest mistake of humanity was to believe it stood above nature instead of within it. Men built towers to reach the sky, while the mountain already created laws to govern behavior, while the wolves lived by instinct more honest than any man-made rule. He thought often about how the world might change if people spent even a single season in silence, listening to the land, feeling their smallness, learning humility from the wind. He had not forgotten his past entirely. Sometimes he still saw his wife's face glow of the fire, her eyes calm and kind, her smile like morning light. But now, when he thought of her, he didn't feel the sharp ache of grief. Instead, he felt gratitude. She had been part of his path, part of the chain of moments that brought him to this place. Even the pain of losing her had meaning now. Without it, he might never have heard the call of the mountain. One evening, as he was tending the fire, he found himself thinking of the wolves again, their discipline, their trust in instinct, their acceptance of death as part of life. He realized that they were never tamed by the world, and that was strength. He wondered if the same could be said of him. Had he become wild again? He smiled faintly at the wildness was not chaos. It was authenticity. It was being unafraid to live by the truth of your own nature. He often told himself that if one day he stopped waking up, if the cold finally took him in his sleep, he would not mind. His story would not end in tragedy, but in return. He would become part of the mountain that had taught him everything. The snow would cover his cabin, the wind would scatter his ashes, and the wolves would carry his scent through the trees. He would become the silence itself. But until that day, he continued to live, not just survive, live with awareness, gratitude. Every fire, every step of snow, every breath of cold air, prayer out word. He had stopped asking the world for meaning. He had become meaning itself. And when the night came again, with the sky full of stars and the faint echo of wolves far in the distance, he whispered quietly, "We are all the same," told in different voices. The years had passed quietly, without count or record. He no longer knew how many winters he had endured, nor how many summers had come and gone since the day he first built his cabin at the edge of the valley. The mountain had erased all need for such measurement. Time, in its human form, no longer existed here. Only rhythm remained, the steady breathing of seas, the heartbeat of rivers, thawing and freezing, the eternal pulse of life, renewing its in silence. The man had grown older, his beard now, his movements slower, but sure. The lines on his face looked carved by wind and frost, not age. There was nothing fragile. He was as much a part of that place as the trees that bent under snow, or the rocks that broke through the frozen earth. He lived now with a serenity that bordered on holiness. Each day began with the same ritual of listening. Before stirring the fire, stepping outside, he would sit for several long minutes in the quiet, letting his senses expand until he could feel the pulse of the land beneath the floor. Sometimes he thought he could even hear the faint tremor of distant ice shifting on the mountain slope, or the soft murmur of snow settling after a storm. He had come to know the difference between every sound, the whisper of wind through spruce needles, the brittle crack of distant branches, the hollow hum that filled the air before snowfall. All of it was language, and he understood it fluently now. He still set traps, though less often. He no longer needed much. His hunger had become small and simple. The cabin was filled with enough supplies to last through long storms, and the wolves' movements provided him guidance about where the game was plenty. The pack still roamed the valley, though he saw them rarely. Their presence was marked instead by traces, prints of snow, distant howl, tufts of fur caught on branches. Every time he found those signs, A faint warmth spread through him, as though greeting old friends. They had become a part of him, not as animals, but as symbols of something greater: discipline, freedom, and trust. One morning, near the end of winter, he awoke to a stillness that felt different. The sky outside glowed faintly blue, the air too calm, too heavy, as if itself. He dressed carefully, pulling on his heavy coat, gloves, and boots, then stepped out into the cold. The world lay untouched, unbroken, tracks or wind. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against the chest until the heart seemed to slow in response. He knew something was coming. The land always warned before it changed. He followed the path that led down to the frozen river, moving slowly, each step deliberate. His breath came in soft cloud, and his boots crunched faintly in the crusted snow. When he reached the bend where the river curved toward the trees, there, across the ice, stood a single wolf, the alpha, older now, its fur streaked with white like his own. The animal watched in silence, its eyes calm and knowing. Behind it, farther up the slope, faint movement betrayed the rest of waiting. The man and the wolf stood like that for a long time, two old creatures bound by history-written snow. There was no fear, no need for dominance, only the wolf stepped forward once, its paws light against the ice, then stopped. It lowered its head slightly, as if in acknowledgment. The man did the same. In that simple gesture, a lifetime of silence found its voice. Then, quietly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and trotted back into the trees, vanishing among the shadows of morning. The man remained there for a while, staring at the place where it had stood. He felt no sadness at their departure, no longing for their return. He understood now that all things, no matter how strong or eternal they seem, move in cycles. Even the mountain, solid and unmoving, was changing with every season. Snow melted, rivers cut deeper, trees fell and grew again. The world was made of endings that fed beginnings. He was part of that pattern, and that knowledge gave him peace. When he returned to the cabin, he sat by the fire and watched the flame. The light flickered across the walls, illuminating the marks of time, scratches, dents, small carvings made over the years. Every mark told a story, some from the storms that had tested the cabin's strength, others from quiet nights when he had needed to keep his hands busy. He reached out and ran his fingers over one of the carvings, a simple outline of a wolf's paw. He had made it long ago, after their first meeting, as a reminder of something he never wanted to forget, that the wild was not his enemy, but his teacher. As days passed, the air grew soft, the light lasted longer each evening, the snow began to sink into itself. He could smell the thaw before he saw it, that damp, earthy scent of the world waking from its long sleep. Spring was coming again, slow and quiet. The rivers would break soon, the birds would return, and the valley hum with life. He felt the rhythm in his bones, the same rhythm that had guided every creature that survived the winter. He spent those days preparing, though not for work. He could feel something changing within himself, a fatigue that was not from labor, but from life. His hands trembled slightly now when he chopped wood, and his breath came shorter on the hills. He did not fight it. He accepted it the way he accepted storms and silence. Everything in the world had its time, and he had lived his in full. He did not regret a single moment, not the cold, not the hunger, the solitude. Every hardship had been a kind of gift, teaching him the language of existence that few ever learn. At night, he began to dream more vividly. He saw the ocean again, the waves breaking against rocks, the faces of those he had lost. But in his dreams, they were no longer. They were part of the landscape, the sea merging with the mountains, the wind carrying their laughter through the trees. He would wake from those dreams smiling, his heart calm, as though he had given permission to rest. One evening, the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the snow in orange light. He sat outside a small bench he had built years ago. The air was cold, gentle. He could hear the faint dripping of melting snow from the eaves of the cabin. The first raven of spring flew overhead, its wings cutting across the sky like black ink on a paper. The man watched it until it disappeared beyond the trees. He thought then about legacy, a word he had once heard often in his younger years, though it had meant something very different back then. Men in the cities spoke of legacy as the things they left behind, the marks they carved into the world to prove they had existed. But out here, legacy was not what you left. It was how deeply you had belonged. His legacy was not written in books or names. It was written in the tracks across his valley, in the firewood stacked neatly by the door, in the wolves that now passed without fear. His existence had blended with the land so completely that when he was gone, it would continue speaking his name in ways only the wind could hear. That night, he built his fire higher than usual. The warmth filled the cabin, and the flickering light danced across it. He sat back, feeling the weight of years settle lightly on his shoulders. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of howling. He listened closely. The wolves had returned to the ridge, their voices echoing across the valley. It was not the cry of hunger, but of presence, a song to mark another cycle, another night, the endless rhythm of life. He smiled faintly, closed his eyes, and whispered a final thought into the room. "I am home." The fire crackled. The wind moved gently through the cracks of the cabin, brushing against his face like a farewell. The night deepened, the howls faded, and silence reclaimed the valley. When morning came, the first light touched the snow outside the cabin, painting in gold. Smoke still rose faintly from the chimney. The man did not stir. He sat as he had left himself, calm and still, his eyes closed, his hands resting softly in his lap. The fire had burned to ash. Outside, a lone wolf crossed the clearing, paused, and turned its head toward the cabin. It stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, then moved on, leaving behind a single set of tracks that wound away into the forest. Days later, the snow began to melt in earnest. The river broke free, the air filled with the scent of earth and pine, and the valley awoke again. Birds returned, calling through the trees. The mountain, eternal and unmoved, watched over it all. The cabin remained standing, quiet and strong, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the man's tools hung neatly on the wall, his coat draped over the chair, his cup beside the cold ashes of everything was in its place, as though waiting for another dawn to come. But perhaps it had come in another way. The silence he had carried all those years had not vanished. It had spread. It filled the cabin, the valley, the trees, and the air. It lingered in the footprints that would fade with the thaw, in the paths he had carved, in the wolves that still roamed the ridge. The man's life had not ended. It had returned to where it began, absorbed into the same quiet truth that had always surrounded him. And if someone, years later, should wander through that valley and find the cabin, they might feel it too. The calm, the reverence, the strange peace that hangs in the air of places where a soul truly belonged. They might not know his name or his story, but they would sense it, the way one senses the weight of time, ancient trees, or the wisdom of stone. The mountain remembers everything that belongs to it, and it had claimed him long ago. In the end, there were no goodbyes, no witnesses, no noise, only silence, the purest kind, the kind that holds the echo of everything it has ever touched. The mountain breathed, the wolves sang, and somewhere in all of it, the man remained. So, if you've listened to this story until now, take a breath and let it rest in you. Remember that solitude is not absence but presence, that silence is not emptiness, truth. And if these words have reached you from some far place, leave your trace and return. Share this story. Let others feel it too, and remember that the world is still listening for voices like his. Comment, subscribe, and carry this silence with you wherever you go, because in every quiet place, story still lives